Today we're going to take a look at the story of Elijah, who's a character that I really love. There's enough in there for a dozen sermons, but you're going to get just two, one this week and one next week, because he had two lockdowns and they were very different. So first of all, we'll have a little bit of background, I guess. King Solomon, after King Solomon had died, the kingdom of Israel split into two. So you get Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The capital of Israel was Samaria, the capital of Judah was Jerusalem. And by and large, the kingdom of Judah sort of kept on with worship of Yahweh, although they didn't do very, very well. But the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, went really astray. They had a whole series of really, really bad kings, and Ahab was the worst of the lot. And this is what it says in 1 Kings 16. It says, Ahab the son of Omri did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. And as though it was not enough to follow the sinful example of Jeroboam, he married Jezebel, the daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and he began to bow down in worship to Baal. First Ahab built a temple and an altar for Baal in Samaria. Then he set up an Asherah pole. He did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of the other kings of Israel before him. When I think of Jezebel, the image that always springs to mind is Cruella de Vil from 101 Dalmatians, pure evil in a dress. Why on earth Ahab married her, God only knows. Whatever the reason, she wore the pants in the marriage and totally controlled him. Not only did she get him to build a temple to Baal, the perverted fertility god, but she also hunted down the true prophets of Yahweh and had them put to death. Enter Elijah from Tishbe onto the scene. Now, the only reason anyone's ever heard of Tishbe is because Elijah came from there. That's the only reason. Tishbe was in the hill country of Gilead, east of the River Jordan, a long way from the capital, a bit like Ramsbottom in the hill country of Lancashire, only less well known. So Elijah was a bit of a hillbilly, and he dressed a bit like one. Described later in Kings as a hairy man with a leather belt around his waist. Instantly recognisable even on the Mount of Transfiguration hundreds of years later. The disciples didn't need an introduction. They knew Elijah was the hairy one with no dress sense. Now, 1 Kings 17 says this. Now Elijah, who was from Tishbe in Gilead, told King Ahab, As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, the God I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word. Then the Lord said to Elijah, Go to the east and hide by Kerith Brook, near where it enters the Jordan River. Drink from the brook and eat what the ravens bring you, for I have commanded them to bring you food. So Elijah did as the Lord told him and camped behind Kerith Brook, east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. But after a while the brook dried up, for there was no rainfall anywhere in the land. So this not too well-dressed, hairy man with a hillbilly accent gives his first recorded prophecy, probably the most daring prophecy in the whole Bible. You'd think, being a novice prophet, he would start with something a little bit less controversial, just in case he gets it slightly wrong. Sort of something like, I think the Lord might be saying that you should give up the Baal worship, Ahab. But no, he's straight in Ahab's face. As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, the God I serve, not a Baal worshipper, there will be no dew or rain for the next few years until I give the word. Now, by saying that he serves the Lord, Yahweh, he instantly makes an enemy of Jezebel and a target for her prophet-killing death squads. And secondly, he's so confident of this prophecy, he says that he's going to be the one who says when the drought's going to end. So God then tells Elijah to go and hide, which is a good idea because Ahab wants to chop his head off. He sends him back to the area that he knows well, not far from his home in Tishbe. So Elijah's first period of isolation is in familiar territory. And you can see from the map where the brook was in relation to Tishbe and to Samaria. Now, brooks are quite small, so if there was no rain, it probably dried up within a month or two. That's a long time when you're hiding. His social distancing would have been more like 2 miles rather than 2 meters. And he didn't have a smartphone, and he couldn't do any Zoom calls, which some of you think is probably a good thing. So there might just have been him and God and maybe some scrolls with the law on. But during that time, God was teaching Elijah something about his provision. And to do that, he does something that was really controversial, and something that Elijah might have thought, well, is that really God that's talking to me? He told him he was going to be fed by ravens. Now, ravens are big black birds, not very good looking, and they're listed as unclean in the law of Moses, which is handed down from God. They were not allowed to be eaten or be used in sacrifice. Most Israelites wouldn't go near them. Also because they're scavengers. They eat all sorts of stuff, including the flesh of dead animals. I'm sure Elijah would have preferred his food being brought by doves or even ducks, but ravens? To his credit, Elijah does exactly what he's told, unlike Jonah. And for a period of time, these unclean birds brought him food twice a day, presumably using the same beaks that had been picking away at a rotten carcass before. Ugh. Unless, of course, God's miracle provision included something in a Waitrose bag. But perhaps being fed by unclean birds for a month or two was how God prepared Elijah for part 2 of his lockdown. See, Ahab had been searching for Elijah to kill him. He even sent death squads into neighbouring countries to try to see if he's there. So when the brook dries up, the Lord then says to Elijah, "Go and live in the village of Zarephath near the city of Sidon. I've instructed a widow there to feed you." So he went to Zarephath, like a really obedient prophet. The story goes on to include this miracle of provision, where the food doesn't run out for 3 years, a miracle of resurrection from the dead, where a son is brought back to life again. But I want to focus on the circumstances that Elijah was being asked to accept. It may have sounded a nice cushy deal, being looked after by a widow, but then Zarephath was not in Israel. It was near Sidon, a Canaanite city. And the Canaanites had been so depraved that God told the Israelites to wipe them out completely when they got into the promised land, which they actually failed to do. They were a nation of Baal worshippers. And to cap it all, Sidon was Jezebel's hometown. So what was God doing, sending Elijah to live with a widow, which wasn't really done, for 3 years in a foreign country where they worshipped a false god, right under the nose of the person who wanted to kill him? If the ravens were unclean, then this whole situation was even more unclean for a follower of Yahweh. But God used both a bunch of ravens and a Canaanite widow to provide for Elijah. Jesus even referred to the incident when he was rejected in his hometown of Nazareth, saying, well, there were lots of widows in Israel at the time of Elijah, but he wasn't sent to any of them, but to a foreigner. So what was God doing with Elijah at this time? Well, I think it was showing him that his provision will not always come from sources that we expect, but it will always come. And I think maybe too he might have been challenging some prejudices that Elijah might have had. We don't really know because the Bible doesn't say. Maybe about foreigners, maybe about things that were taboo. But certainly it was pointing forward to Jesus' radical teaching on what was clean and what was unclean. And also to Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10, where he sees this in a trance, a sheet full of unclean birds and animals coming down from heaven. And God tells him, "Rise up, Peter, and eat." And Peter says, "I can't do that. It's not kosher." As Peter then said to Cornelius, the centurion, "You know it's against our laws for a Jewish man to enter a Gentile home like this or to associate with you. But God has shown me that I should no longer think of anyone as impure or unclean." And that was really the start of the church becoming a church for the whole world, not just for Jews. Now the widow and her son were saved from starvation by God's provision through Elijah. But it wasn't a one-way relationship. She'd put him up in her home for 3 years. So in a way, that saved him too. I think we're going to be really surprised by some of the people we find at the banqueting table in heaven. On earth, they don't look the nicest, talk the poshest, smell the sweetest, or even have the right theology. But in heaven, they're all going to be shining like stars. I guess that Elijah learned a lot during his lockdown. We can only speculate as to what he did in 3 years, how they interacted in the house, what they learned from each other. We do know that Elijah was already a man of faith and courage, but God wants more than that from us. He wants us to know him. He wants us to learn how to become more like him. Colossians 3:10 says, "Put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator and become like him." You know, pearls are made when an oyster deals with an irritant that gets into its shell. Maybe just a speck of sand or a parasite. It's not comfortable for the oyster, but the result is a beautiful pearl as it deals with the irritant. Lockdown has not been comfortable for any of us. It's been an irritant. But through its uncomfortableness, if that's a word, God wants to make pearls out of us. So my question for you today is this: what has God been up to in your life during this period of lockdown and isolation? What's he been showing you? What have you learned, or are you still learning? And would you have learned that if things had been normal? I'm going to send those questions out on the Hope Encouragement WhatsApp group, and it would be wonderful, if you think appropriate, to share your answers during the coming week to encourage us all. Next week, we'll have a look at part 2 of Elijah, when he goes into what I would call a lockdown of the soul.